All right, so I am going to develop some features of my Webpack plugin that I've been working on. This is for Next.js. And today I think what I'm going to try to do is get the global chunk or a global remote registration working correctly. So what that actually means is in the scenario that I've got here, I need something similar to publicPath auto, but inside of Node.js. PublicPath auto is the ability for the container to figure out the URL that it came from to load the rest of its chunks. So it allows us to not have to hard code a location from where the remote comes from. Currently, I have something like that implemented, but it only works within the local scope of the current application. So the problem is usually the remote itself doesn't have its own URL, and I need the host application to provide a map list of all the URLs that it has so that the remote can find itself, if that makes sense. So if we look at what that would look like, if I go to, let's say, like the shop application and go to the next config. So in here I have all three of them listed. So shop as a remote would have its own name embedded inside of itself. So it knows what it needs to do. If I remove it, and then if I were to try and go to another application, such as the home application, and import a federated module from shop, it would not know what it's supposed to go off and do. Wouldn't know where to come from. So what we're going to try to do is build a kind of registration system that allows us to map all of them together. So I'm going to switch over to the SSR branch here. Oops, and now I have to go and get diff all of this. Hey, where'd my WebStorm crashed on me. Let's open it again. All right, and we're back. Okay, yep, and pull out the latest here. All right, so I'm gonna comment out shop from shop itself. And now if I go into the plugin, where I would want to go is into the node portion of the plugin here. And then what I should be able to see is under my common.js chunk loading pattern that I use, if I look inside of here, inside the file system itself, I should have something like a variable called remotes. There we go. So I have something where I go and I split the known remotes into an object and print them out. And so what this looks like inside of an actual build, if I go static SSR remote entry and look up var remotes, is I'll get this line here. So this is not helpful if, say, I have a federated import to shop. The consuming app would import this container, and then the container would be saying that it needs something like, let's say, home / whatever, or in this case it's the home app. So this container would be saying, all right, I'm home app, We know that. And now when it needs to load chunks, it needs to load them from itself. But it usually wouldn't list its own remote in its build. It would list the remotes that it depends on, not itself. So it doesn't actually have any mapping to know how to load its own chunks, because I don't have the script to resolve the rest of the chunk mapping from. So the plan here is going to be to try and create some kind of a registry system where all of the remote chunks are essentially loaded into some kind of a global scope. And to do that, we're going to need to know the name of its global itself, because these are the things that need to register. I don't need its internal name or its alias, because it could be, you could have multiple versions. So it could be, I import it as home / whatever, but its global is actually home_app. So these globals could change, creating different sets of unique globals, different types of versions of different remotes that could be at each host or remote level. So what I need to register everybody as is by their global names, so that I actually get the unique ones in there, not by their nice name or their alias. All right, so let's get into the plugin itself. Okay, so I'm going to stick in the Node plugin. I'm just reading over the code that I wrote out here. So what I do is I create an object with global and URL, and I return an accumulator of them onto a local variable. And then I think this should be easy enough. I should be able to just use a assignment operator, in this case because they're strings, and be able to assign all the remote URLs, or all their strings, into wherever they need to go. But I need to ensure that these are actually going to give me the @ syntaxes, and that these don't get transformed into they don't get transformed into like a promise new promise syntax or something like that. So we're just going to see what a fresh build gives me. So I just use this yarn debug, which is kind of this crummy hack that I put together to just copy all the files and build them all in a certain way. And this is what I currently get out of here. So I just want to make sure that what I'm still getting is a global name and a URL. And then all I think I'm going to do with this is I'm going to try to do like an object assign into the global scope. So I already have something called global remote scope. And so what remote scope is used for is for registering the actual Webpack runtime container itself. So if we look in my plugin, you'll see that in here, inside of the node runtime, I fetch the chunk, I load the chunk, and once I've got the chunk loaded, I then take its container and I take the module name of it and I register it on the global scope. This is a very similar pattern to what we do in the window. So when you go window.remote get, it's the same concept, but instead of sticking it directly in the globals, I'm sticking everything under remote scope. So if I need to loop over them or anything like that, I can find them more easily. So it just makes it a little bit easier to keep track of, what I'm actually trying to look at. All right, so we can go back over to our build output and let's see what we're getting on a remote entry from the server, and if I look up var remotes, okay, great. So I still get my at syntax, which is what I want. And then you'll see here now I'm going global remote scope. It'll show me all the remote scopes I have available. If we look here, I can just load one of the apps through a client-side exception. That's probably because I removed a critical dependency from it, but let's try a different one. Cool. And now we can see remote scope, the home app. I can see that the getter and the get and init is being set on the global object. So every remote that this thing would consume should continue to tack on this onto the object. And then here I'm obviously drilling into the specific one that I want. And I see I'm getting the container just like I would get in a browser. So now I should just be able to merge these together. So since everything in Webpack is just templates, it's all strings, we should just be able to create another string here. And I'm going to say that global dot. Now I need a good scope to put these on. I might still put it under the remote scope as it is. So let's keep using remote scope. And then what I'll do is create another key on this object, another private variable, we'll call it. Let's see, we'll go for configs. All right, so we're gonna assign this in here. Global remote scope configs. That would go object dot assign. And then I'm going to double check that my remotes are printing the way that I want them to, because I want the globals to overwrite, because you should never have two conflicting globals, but I don't want the aliases to overwrite, because that's not accurate. So I just want to make sure that, yeah, cool, home app. So these should always be unique. And if you ever have a collision of the name, of the global name, then you're going to have a bigger problem anyway, just like it would in the browser. So I can merge them together without too much of a problem. And the only thing I need to do is, since this won't exist at the beginning, let's see where I first define global remote scope. I believe I define it inside the runtime itself. Inside my promise new promise. So that should be generated somewhere inside of here. If it will find it for me, which it won't. Remote scope. Okay, so here we go, remote scopes. This is where I just set it up to get going. And then in here, I'm going to just create a key called config. Underscore config. And what this should be is, it would usually be these configs here, which is like the at syntax, but I can either assign it on in the chunk loading, but I actually think what I might do is assign it on inside the promise new promise, because that'd be a little bit earlier on in the life cycle. And it'd probably be a better place to put some of this code. So, ooh. But I don't know if I can because that's the at syntax. I'd have to reparse it, which isn't bad. It's just, I think for right now, I'm going to keep doing it inside the load file convention because whatever happens, it has to run load file anyway, so I can register them on the fly. All right, so now that configs is going to exist. Config, make sure I get the spelling of it right. Yes, config, remote scope. All right, so object assign that, config, and then what I'm going to assign into it is just the remotes themselves. And then that should start merging everything together. All right, and then we'll just put another one here for remote scope configs. And we can see if this starts to chain together. And then if it does, what we would want to do is down here where I derive the URLs, so I should have derive. Yeah, so in here, requested remote, I go remotes, the current name of the remote, which is like home app or whatever, but instead of doing this off of remotes, I would be doing this off of the remote scope configs, because I would want to search all the containers connected to the network at the current time and find who's got the key for home app or shop, because I am home app in this scenario. I wouldn't know my own URL. My parent would. So I would need my parents and my siblings to assign all their variables into a scope so that when you run me, I can look up, okay, who am I? Where did I come from? This is the URL I came from. This is the location where I should start to load all of my other chunks. So just like a document current script source, very similar, but we have no current script source convention, so the closest one is this lookup where all the parents register who their configs are, and the children can look up their own name and the parent and get their absolute URL. All right, so now let's see what this does. Yeah, so config. Then, yeah, inside of here I have this little build remotes thing. All this does is take the at syntax you provide and convert it into a promise do promise where I resolve the execute load command. If the remote is offline or anything like that, I have the option to bail out of it. In the old design, I used to support something like middleware. Also had to hook into the share scopes like by hand. And what I'd probably still bring back is this kind of proxy method here. So if something goes wrong and the remote's not online, I would fake the resolution of it to prevent Webpack from crashing. But for right now, I'm trying to keep this template small. So it's just a couple lines of code here. All right, let's see. That brought the app up to some degree. It's about to derive its request. Remote scope configs. There we go. So now I'm seeing the remote's known to home app. The remote's keyed by global name. And now the remote scope configs. And since all three apps are here, they always should kind of look the same. But if I'm under a different scenario, I would have this be missing a few, and then this should gather more as time goes on. But I just want to ensure that my chunk loading is set up properly before I try and do that. Okay, great. So that looks good. Remotes config, it's assigning them all in, all of the correct variables, making its request, and then now if I have nested remotes, it's diving back over this time and time again to put it together. So what I'm going to do now is just check out what I get in my browser here. So I'm getting an issue trying to load remotes, or in the browser trying to load off of port 3000. Alright, so port 3000 is running, but the scripts never got emitted. So I'd want to go and check chunks here, which exists. The framework chunk is there, so let's see what I've got in here. Make sure I haven't added anything I shouldn't have. That all looks fine. Static chunks. Alright, so I'm trying to get ant d from 3000 from static chunks, so let's go in here and see if we have a 86c. Looks like there might be some caching I need to take care of as well here. So just to ensure this isn't a Webpack cache issue, we're just going to wipe all the next caches out. And we'll run this debugger again. And there's a lot of to-dos in here for stuff I can clean up, but I think for the most part, this ought to work. Take the remotes, assign config, assign the remotes into them. Yeah, okay. All right, and then make sure I have my network cache disabled. Yes, I do. Let's wait for this to build out. All right, looks like they're coming up. Yeah, about to derive making request. This is where it's going to try to go to. Going to try to get the shared nav. All of them are offline, so it bails out of it, and then the server comes up. Boom. Okay, there we go. And now you can see all the code executing on the server side as it goes and retrieves all the chunks that I want it to get. And then I've got my configs in here with all the configs. I've got home app, because that's the only remote that the home app uses. Wait, that 3001, that's the shop app. Yeah, that's the only thing that the shop app uses. And then what I want to do is I actually want to test my nested remote scenario with the global registration. So if I try to do nested remotes right now, I believe it's going to crash because I have another pull request open where I fixed that. So let's just see what happens. If I'm inside shop, I want to, let me see, what was the scenario I used here? Let me cut a branch with this on here, and I'm gonna try to merge my other branch that I've got here. So global remote config. All right, just gonna commit this up. And now if I jump over here and go to next.js-mf, right, there we are. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open this PR, even though it's not ready yet. I'll fill out the details on it later. And the main thing that I want is the nested remote import. So what I had to do here is, if I would import a remote inside of another remote, what ended up happening was twofold issue. One, I used child compilers to make this run for Next, since Next is still completely incompatible. So what I'm doing is, inside of the main plugin itself, we get to this Next Federation plugin here. Inside the apply step, I have some things around if it's the client or the server. And then I get to the Federation plugin, and if it's the client, it's using Webpack Container Module Federation plugin. If it's the server, it's using the Node Federation plugin, which is like my server-side one. And then everything gets applied really down in the child federation. So this goes into a child compiler, which kind of branches the main compiling instance, creates a branch of it, and lets me change the output options or change some of the plugins or whatever else, and still run like a very efficient build off of that, where it uses the parent compilations cache and already parsed tree. So it's a lot more efficient for doing stuff compared to like my sidecar design that I had before, which just ran 4 copies of Webpack side by side. And so inside of here, I had this issue with my plugin. You'll see it in here. Over here, if it's the client, sorry, it's early morning. I'm using the Federation plugin, which is still Module Federation plugin. I've just got this child-friendly version of it, which just removes one hook out of Federation. But then in the server side, I'm still using Federation plugin. So when the child compiler is running and building its remotes, it would, when coming across another remote import inside of the child build, it was importing them as like this. Let's say home app at HTTP, because it was considered an external. It's an external to Webpack, and Webpack doesn't know what to do with the syntax, so it's going to just pass it through as a require without the Node Federation plugin to do the transform. So on this branch, all I had to do was really switch it to Node Federation plugin, and then in Node Federation, I have an optional context object, so I want to pass Module Federation plugin to it, because when running in the child compiler, I need the child-friendly version of the Federation plugin. So that's all I really had to do. And then at the top of when I build my remotes, to make sure that I don't get stuck in like a recursive loop, I don't want to put the promise new promise syntax inside the load command if it's already the promise new promise. So this just kind of lets me bail out of it if I've already converted it. So, and then over here, I'm just going to test it by, inside of shop, I'm going to add an import to home shared nav. So what I'm actually going to do is merge this into the SSR branch now. And then I can pull the SSR back in here. And then we can test this whole nested remote where I can remove some of these. And then we'd be able to see, we'll be able to see if this actually registers everything correctly, because we'll have a use case where we would need the lookup. At least in my simple demo app right now. All right, cool. So I've merged these together, pulled in the nested remotes. So now if I look at the PR that I'm trying to do this against, I'm going to say inside of shop, I'm going to look for home. So then to make sure that home isn't dependent on this, I'm going to go to home and I'm going to remove the remote entry config for itself, which is what would usually be. Okay. Now let's run another build here. Now we should see, when I run it, we should see the home container somewhere in there when we start running this, we should see there be some kind of difference where we don't have all the configs, and then it builds up as the execution happens, and it starts to tack on more at syntaxes onto that config object that we just created, which would mean that it's now operable. I'm still not using it to actually reference anything, so when I try and start this server, I imagine it's going to crash. But let's see what it actually ends up doing. Let me see if the builds all came up. Pending promise, refused connection, which is all fine. All right, and now if we try to load this, there we go. See, look at that. Requested remote is undefined. So it's not able to derive the result that it wants because it is home app and it can't find itself in its object because these are the keys known to the remote. See? But if I look under here, home app, should have these. Actually, it should have the config to itself listed in here as well. Shop checkout, shop checkout. Let's double check. So I'm inside of home, trying to go through 3001. Home app. Okay, yeah. And then it hangs here because it can't find itself, so that's what I would expect to happen. So then inside of my remote chunk loading runtime module, I've got all my configs listed here. That's for every remote entry that I come across. But the parent configs are not registered in here because this is only executed when I'm inside the remote entry. So the host would never actually register its known variables into the same scope. Okay, so we have a scope miss on this. So to fix that, this is an interesting one. All right, so to try and make that work, I'm going to have to actually put something in the promise new promise because the host needs to register its available variables, which means I should probably move this out of here and into the promise syntax itself and have it loop over and register this stuff on the fly. Okay. So then I'm going to remove that and move it into here. I create the remote scope, I create the config. And then I would be saying, instead of var remotes, this is going to give me, for each remote requested, it's going to register one. So all I need to do is split it on the URL and the global. So I won't have this whole, I don't need this whole loop now. So I would be saying remote scope, so global dot remote scope global remote scope, and then it would be the name of the current app. No, it wouldn't be. So I need to split this to get what I need out of it. So I'm going to get rid of that since I don't need most of it. I'm going to go up before the load template exists. Bail out if it's already that. And then here I would be getting it off of the config. Yeah. Global and URL, and then in here I would be saying global equals all right, and so the reason that I have to do this is because the remote loading part of the runtime only runs inside of the remote, but the host, so the one who fires this initial last mile portion, is the only place where this piece will run. So what I have to do is actually have the host register each remote that it's going to request, register that into the scope for me ahead of time. So now I've got the scope that I want off of it, and all I need out of here is the configs portion of it. So I would go config global remote scope config, the name of the global, so home, shop, whatever, and the URL that I want to use. And then every time I fire off one of these, it's going to stick another one into the scope. So hopefully what I'll see is my my additional app show up in here. Then that means that I still have this whole register part, so I should actually be able to keep this. I won't actually need it though, because these are the ones known to it. I'll keep it so that it doesn't crash, but I'm not actually going to utilize it, because what I want to see is this thing start to grow and expand with various containers. And then I suppose I can also merge the remote ones on there, but I think it's redundant to have this whole assignment operation on here. I'm not entirely sure though, but let's just restart it and see what it does. And for some context here, let me explain what's going on, because this file's kind of big. But this is pretty much the load file chunk loading runtime module. So inside the Webpack runtime, this is how it requires code. So whenever you import or require anything, what you're actually doing is you're running this runtime module. So when I rebuild the remote here, which is now done, look at that, there we go, config. Now home is registered. And you can see these are the ones known to the remote, but these are the ones registered inside of it. So this is still unresolvable because I don't know the name of it, but now these are all going to point to the global registry, so I think we have it working. All right, so let me show you what this file actually does. So how I make all this work is I am taking over what require means to Webpack. So this is the file system operation for how code is loaded inside the Webpack runtime. It's usually called read file VM, and it's used when you use an async node target. So what I've done is I've taken the CommonJS chunk loading system, I've made another copy of it where I just do what it usually does, which is function read file. a bunch of templating stuff for installing the chunks, blah, blah, blah. And then pretty much I get to my else condition here. So if the file doesn't exist, which should be, if there's a file name, do that, else, and then I go and I pull it over the network. And that's where all of my code happens. So what this looks like in the built world because it's easier to explain from here, is here we go. So this is how Webpack requires code in the server, in async node world, is read file VM. So we have chunk installation where we push promises. We've got this little guy on here, which is just a promise. And this isn't a promise, new promise. It's just how Webpack does it. New promise, async, resolve reject, install chunk data where it gives me the statuses and whatever. Gets the file name from the current directory plus the chunk ID. So looking in wherever it's coming from, its usual chunk ID. And then I use fs and I go, hey, fs, does the file exist? If so, read the file. I get the content of the file. I create a chunk object for it. And then I run in this context and I pass in the usual Webpack wrapper, the content of the read file, and then the context from the Webpack runtime, and it will install the chunk. If the file doesn't exist locally, now here's load script, my little script loader. Here's where all of my code comes in, and just kind of strip away some of the magic here. All it is it's that. It's load script content run in this context. So basically all I've done is this, fs.read file, which is exactly what Webpack is now I've just basically made it this. Fetch, more or less, with a callback parameter. So it's not as magical as it seems. It's really just exactly what Webpack does anyway, their code, and the only difference is that this uses load script. And that file name is now and then for file name what I've done, because I need a URL to get it from, so if you look here, I literally do the same thing down here. I get the chunk name, I get the path, so I get the script URL, so the remote entry, I get the path name of it, and then I pretty much go off the path name and I replace, what do I replace? I replace the remote entry.js file with the chunk name JS file. So all I'm doing is I'm saying, cool, well, here's a remote, so if I were to code this out, it's pretty much remote, let's see, URL dot replace, and all I'm going to do is say, in this case, if we were to just make a simple example, remote entry.js, and I'm going to replace it with the chunk name. Ta-da! Now I get localhost 3000 SSR or chunks, static chunks SSR, and instead of remote entry, I get whichever chunk I want. And now I know the path. And that's how I automate the public path. Is I just say, cool, I know the remote entry, I know how to get to the chunk, remove the word remote entry, and replace it with the chunk. Boom. Now I can get wherever I need to get. Alright, so now that all this is hooked up, we should still get the code should still not actually run in the front end here. Yeah, see, so I'm still hanging on this endless promise, and that's because it cannot derive the remote to make the request. So to resolve that last piece, I'm going to go into read file, look up derive. Okay, about to derive the request. All right, and what I'm going to do inside of here is on requested remote is currently remote's name. We now know that remote's is not reliable because remote's keyed here, remote's known to home app. So right now when I'm inside of, so if I go back to my GitHub, under this example, I'm on shop right now. So remotes known to shop are more. If I can find where shop even has them, but the remotes known to shop, there's more remotes known to shop. But the remotes known to home, which is what I'm in, because now shop is going to call on the home remote entry. The remotes known to the home app, it only knows about shop and checkout because that's what it uses. It doesn't use itself, so it would never keep its own script. So only shop has the home app remote. So it needs shop's configs for it to know what it's supposed to do. And the only thing that the remote knows is its global name. And that's how I can now look it up, because each global should be unique. I shouldn't have any collisions, so I shouldn't have home_app more than once with two different URLs. Home_app is like what goes on the window. It's not what I'm requiring. So you'll see I still require home. And what it resolves to is like window home_app. So these can always be unique. So I can always just search the scope and find what global is that. There should only be one. There can never be more than one. If you do want more than one, you would have versioned remotes, which means that home app would have a version under it, and they would all still be unique, and I could still look them up. So either way, this is a pretty foolproof mechanism. It's similar to how I do it in the browser. So I don't think I need this global remotes config anymore either, so I'm just going to go ahead and clean this stuff out. I mean, if I need it, I can go and get it again from... Let's see, okay, yeah, that gets rid of the if, that gets rid of the assignment. And what is this one, rogue? Operator 4, I just want to make sure I don't miss anything here. I think I can get rid of that too. So there's the known scopes, and then I'm going to go back to about to derive requests. So instead of using the remotes variable, which is the local one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reassign them here, and I'm just going to create, let's see, so I still have remotes from my local scope, which merges everybody together. And I should have an assignment where, yeah, okay, so I'll keep that. But they're now going to be referenced off of this object key. So I'm going to look for about to derive. And then just to make it easy on myself, let's create a variable for these. Remote registry equals that. There we go. Now I've got a nice variable to look it up by. I'll use a const. I don't think there should ever be a case where this is in the same closures. Alright, so then under here, all of these guys are going to now point to the remote registry instead of remotes. So the requested remote I should get. I no longer need that. Cool, so just one place to replace it. Yep, those are the keyed ones. Remotes variable in cases remotes does not have its own URL. Great, I can get rid of that. To do, because we just solved it. And while I'm in here, before I forget, let me see if I have a Git issue related to this that I can close out as well. Compilation pipeline to emit files. I'm pretty sure that I can close this while I'm in here. Still need the Webpack strings replacement stuff to happen. Alright, looks like I missed this issue, so I do have a bot that attempts to open issues for me, so let me see if I just accidentally closed it. No, okay, cool, no issue for it. That doesn't matter right now. Okay, great. So now let's run this last build and see if it works. Then if it works, I think we're done with this little setup here. Or like we'll have done what this stream was mostly about, which is just trying to get that one piece to work, which is this registry system. Requested remote. And so now, similar to the window, I have a way to look this stuff up, which is great because now if I want to say hot reload it and figure out who changed or what changed, I now have the remote registry. So I can anywhere in the code base look up remote registry, and I can also do dynamic remotes inside of Node because I can always look up the name on the variable. I can just go global underscore remote config, whatever I called it, remote scope, and then I could say home app dot get, and I can ask for anything out of it. And if I need to do anything with the URLs, like for flushing the chunks out of what's used, all of that would be under the config scope here. So I'm able to get the name of the script on either end. Getting the browser version of it, that's something I still need to deal with, but that'll be a whole separate thing. Boom, and there we go, it loaded it. Excellent. And now if we go and look in here, we can see, cool, remote scope, home app gets it, making request to 3000, boom, boom, and yep, there we go, perfect. Home doesn't know about itself. When merged together, home now knows about itself, therefore can fetch itself, and now the rest of the code base is running. Excellent. All right. So let us just commit this up. Yep, okay. All right, great. So that pretty much covers this this thing that I was trying to do. I'm gonna go and actually tweak my PR now to give a bit of a description here. But that pretty much covers my time for today. So hopefully that gives a little bit of insight into what I was trying to do. And thank you to my 6 viewers for coming and watching this. Hopefully I'll get better with these over time. This was the first time I've actually done a live stream. But yeah, I'm going to try and stream as much of this plugin development as I can. So thanks for watching.